So, welcome. My name's Andy Ross. We moved over to the coast last year, so we've been here 20 months. Loving living here on the west coast of New Zealand, having come from London in Andrew's case, my husband's case, and Shetland in my case. And it's really great to have Christmas weather that's hot and sunny rather than dark and rainy. I trained in opera. I also trained in hotel and catering and chefing, and then I retrained in textile design as a researcher. I have a master's degree in research, looking at textile design, principally Shetland tweed. And towards the end of my time in Shetland, I had a tweed company that made cloth. In fact, this is one of the cloths that I made, and we have another which we'll show you a little later on. I'd like to introduce Caroline McQuarrie, and I shall let you tell everybody about yourself.
Sure, thanks Andy. I'm Caroline. I live in Zealand Aotearoa, Wellington in the North Island, and I have been there for just over 20 years, but I was born and grew up here in Greymouth. And I'm an artist and an academic. I teach at McQuarrie University in the College of Creative Arts. I'm a senior lecturer in photography, and my undergraduate degree in fine arts from Canterbury was in photography, and I worked in the UK for a while in the photographic industry, mostly in the production end of things. But I have always had an interest in textiles since I was a child. And even in my undergraduate degree was combining photography with textiles in my art practice. And when I did my master's degree at McQuarrie, which is coming up for 20 years ago, I realised next February will be 20 years since I started my master's, I ended up making sort of sculptural textile works for that. So since then have kind of oscillated between photography and textiles, but also in a lot of cases kind of combined the two. So sometimes I work with just one or the other, but oftentimes I combine the two in various ways.
Great.
So, yeah.
Thank you, Caroline. Before we go any further, I'm going to do a very quick visual description of where we are for people who need it. I am a white middle-aged man, balding, very, very balding, and we're sitting on our green couch in our hall, which is where we live, a gospel hall in Greymouth, surrounded by our art collection. We've been collecting art for a very long time, Andrew's case 50-something years, and I have a textile collection which is housed elsewhere, but we're surrounded by paintings and photographs in a beautiful space, a beautiful wooden building with corrugated iron outside. Would you like to describe yourself a little?
Yeah, so I'm a white Pākehā middle-aged woman. And actually that's one of the things that I'm interested in my art practice. One of the themes that I come back to is Pākehā histories in this country. So yeah.
So for those who don't know what Pākehā means, what is Pākehā?
Yeah, so Pākehā is the Māori word for, it originally just meant non-Māori, but it has come to mean New Zealanders of European extraction, which often gets applied to people who have been here, whose families have been here for a number of generations. There are various other sort of terms. Tauiwi is one that's used, or sometimes tangata tiriti, meaning people of the treaty. But yeah, Pākehā is probably the term that's been used for longest to describe European New Zealanders.
Great, and if anybody's interested in learning more Maori words, the Te Ara encyclopedia online is very, very good, and will show you how to pronounce the words as well as the meaning of them. I came from Zimbabwe. I was born in Rhodesia in 1969 in a town called Bulawayo, which is in the south, cotton producing town. And I remember when I was at school doing projects about cotton production and weaving. And that's sort of where my interest began in textiles. But it was thanks to my mum who taught us how to sew. I used to make shorts and shirts and things like that at home for my friends and I to wear. That I really became interested in textiles, and it was a long time until I felt entirely comfortable with being in the textile industry, partly because it was sort of seen as a woman's job, and partly because as a gay man that is what you're going to go into, so it took a lot of reconciling in my head. But having moved to New Zealand, where everybody just accepted the fact that I was a weaver and interested in fashion and textiles as a matter of course, has been really freeing. I'm really interested in the way that textiles include identity and histories and can be used, and I think that's part of your work, isn't it, Caroline?
Yeah. I also, had this interest in textiles from childhood, and I also learned a lot from my mother, who's here, who has made a lot of sort of textile work of varying kinds through her life, and for me it's I think I would really agree with that idea that textiles really often are a way to sort of signal who we are. We use clothing to sort of tell people about ourselves and to sort of signal all sorts of things about ourselves, but I'm also really I'm fascinated in the way that even going back to earliest civilizations, which was sort of textile production was seen as one of the earliest ways that to sort of signal early civilizations as going from being kind of hunter-gatherer to being settled, and to farming, and to keeping animals, and then to producing cloth. Mm-hmm. And so I think in the contemporary world we very much take textiles for granted, and we don't really think very much about their production because it's something that kind of happens a long way away from where most of us live. But I think that's probably a fairly recent phenomena. I think for a long time the production of textiles and production or augmentation or creation with textiles was something that was really just part of that happened alongside everyday life, and so as an artist I'm interested in thinking about those kind of ideas. I particularly make a lot of work about histories, and so I'm particularly interested in historical textiles. I've made works that look at the form of the embroidered sampler, and I'm also particularly interested in women's histories, and so I think for a lot of women, and women's creative sort of outlets, and I think for a lot of women through a lot of history, textiles were a way to have some creativity, to express themselves within the sort of restrictions that society put on them in kind of other ways.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So this last week, Caroline and I were very lucky to go down to Hokitika, which is just down the road from us, to look at a collection that came out from England. It is a historic collection, a family collection. Some of the pieces in it are over 100 years old, and the detail in the costumes, there's night dresses, ordinary daytime dresses, skirts, all sorts of things in this collection, and the detail that those have is incredible. Tiny pin tucks and little pleats, lots of embroidery and things that really we don't see people doing anymore, but in the olden days people used to do that all the time, didn't they?
I mean, I guess we do different things, right? We textiles these days tend to be, printing on textiles is a big thing, right? Rather than maybe embellishing through stitching. And so I guess these things change as kind of productions changed. It was really interesting looking at that collection and trying to think about which of what work was done maybe by the person whose collection it was. So and what work was done by people for whom it was their job to produce these kinds of textiles. So in both instances, almost entirely handmade, but whether it was handmade by someone who was a skilled homemaker, or whether it was handmade by somebody perhaps of a lower socioeconomic group who was making a living through the production of these textiles, and then also thinking about the different parts of the world that production might have been made in. So we were looking at some pieces that looked like they were perhaps produced in India or in Turkey, and based on some of the way that the designs were made, and thinking about sort of, they were mostly late 19th, early 20th century pieces. That's a period in history where a lot of production had gone from Europe into other countries, and then the goods would flow. The goods would flow into Europe, and they were still being handmade. They were just being handmade by different people. And I'm quite interested in those kinds of thinking about those kinds of things, about who can make a living out of making certain things in what part of the world, and then as production becomes cheaper in another part of the world, how that looking at those kind of global shifts, thinking about just as one example, weaving production, becoming automated, and so then those artisans have losing the work in various parts of the world, but maybe still being hand produced in other parts of the world because labour is cheaper. And so these things sort of shifting and changing as sort of industrialisation and globalisation kind of moves things around to different parts of the world. And so then what does that mean for the people who want to work in that kind of way in the countries where, in the sort of westernised countries generally, who then become maybe artisans making higher end work rather than producing kind of mass production of textiles. So yeah, it's an interesting thing to think about in terms of this country, and I know that's something that you thought about a lot, in terms of what does it mean to if you want to make a living off production of textiles, how do you navigate that space between sort of being able to be paid enough in order to be able to make it viable, and it's something that in a way I've sort of skirted a wee bit because I'm conscious I'm talking about sort of production and mass production, but that's not at all what I do. So being an artist, I get to sort of think about these things and kind of dabble and stuff, but I don't have to. I'm not needing to sort of mass produce things in order to make a certain number of things in order to be trying to make a living off it. So I get to think about the ideas around it, but I don't have to necessarily grapple with the realities of it.
Well, that seems like a nice segue into some of your ideas.
Yeah,
would you like to
sure.
show us something?
Yeah, sure. So my latest project is still in progress. So the works I'm going to show you are maybe part of the finished pieces, but not necessarily the whole thing. I recently got to do, I was very lucky, I got to do a residency in the North Island. It's a fairly new art residency called The Gullies, and it's on a farm which is called The Gullies, and it's been set up by Laura and Richard Morrison, who are a couple who they own a farm, and they have a house on the farm, which is most of the time an Airbnb, but for 8 weeks of the year they offer it to an artist to live in and to make work. And I was the second person to be awarded the residency, which was really amazing. I feel very lucky. My application said that I wanted to use the time to improve my weaving skills. I'm a fairly new weaver, so I really wanted some time to be able to kind of learn how to get better at that. And I was thinking a lot about farming landscape, and the way that farming changes the landscape, the way that we kind of divide it up. We divide the land up into sort of paddocks and sort of even properties, and then interior inside that paddocks. So thinking about land as a commodity and something that can be divided into smaller and smaller packages, if you like. But also thinking about how that is very much a kind of a surface layer on the land. And so I like the idea of thinking about it as like a piece of, a farm is like almost a fabric that's been laid on top of the landscape. It only, the impacts of farming do seep down into the earth a little way, but not deeply really, and if humans went away, it would disappear pretty quickly. And I was also thinking about, I was using wool, thinking about, so the farm that I was on was a sheep and beef farm, so they do produce some wool, and thinking about wool as in the history of New Zealand, wool was very, very important in terms of the colonial economies, and is one of the things that really drove New Zealand forward economically, was the production of wool. So I decided to, partly just because I wanted to, when you start weaving, there's all sorts of possibilities. You can do all sorts of things, right?
Absolutely.
So you've got to, in some ways, you've got to give yourself some parameters and some limits, so that you can to then experiment within. So I decided that I would just work with undyed wool initially. I figured it's enough to think about kind of structure and texture without bringing colour into it at this stage. I'm sure I'll work with colour at some point, but yeah, initially at least, I think it was really helpful to just limit myself a little bit. And so while I was away, I worked on 2 different looms, thinking about working with grids. So I had an 8-shaft loom, which I warped up to be in sort of sections, so you can see that they kind of alternate as you go across. And thinking very much about texture. So initially just starting with grids, with sort of plain grids, and then working with I made a number of things. I just tried a different thing in each piece. So these were really very much test works. So then sort of thinking about complicating the grid a little bit, so making it less regular. So with the way that I had the loom warped, I had the vertical lines were kind of set, but I could choose when I changed the weave pattern vertically. And then I also took a 4-shaft loom in which I was just testing a sort of also grids, but sort of simpler ways of creating them, if you like. And this is just with the spacing of the warp horizontally, so hopefully you can see that there are places where the warp is tighter and then places where it's looser, and then just replicating that as I worked vertically with how tightly I beat the weft as I sort of worked through the piece. And I actually created this initially. I was thinking about the embroidery technique called white work, which where you often open up, you use a white fabric and white embroidery thread, and then you often open up the weave of the fabric. And I wanted to sort of try that on some of my own weaving. And so initially I was thinking of this, I was going to do sort of little embroidery pieces in the squares, but then I made it and I just quite liked it as it was. So I don't know.
To embellish
so I don't know whether I will. I don't know whether I will actually end up doing that. And then after I came home, so I have an exhibition in February in Wellington. So I have to start thinking about what I'm going to make for the exhibition. I have a plan for some larger sculptural works where I'm going to make some longer versions of these and maybe use some of these ones as well, but sort of hang them over. I like the idea of sort of hanging them so that they become kind of hills, and sort of trying to think about using the kind of the ability that fabric has to drape and how I can sort of work with that. But the exhibition is at a dealer gallery, and so you always want to have a few things that can are a little bit easier for people to buy. So I also have made these small, the top and bottom there is just as a way of hanging it, but small pieces which will be using the similar kind of grid pattern. Hopefully you can see that. Which will there'll be a backing board, and that will kind of wrap around the backing board, and then they'll go on a frame, so that they're a little bit simpler to kind of take home. So again, I've done very similar things with a series of these, as I did with the tests that I did on the residency, just using the yarn that I was using on the residency was a 4-ply, and then this is just a beautiful little lace weight yarn that I got from Anna Grattan in Fielding, who was very close to where I was on the residency. So Anna Grattan is she has a business where she has her own sheep, and she produces yarn mostly for knitters, but also a lot of weavers use her beautiful yarn as well. And yeah, I got to go and visit her while I was there, because it was just half an hour drive, which was great. I'd ordered from her before, but I never visited where she.
That must be like a child in a sweet shop.
It was great. Yeah, it was fantastic. It's difficult because you go in and you specifically wanting to buy one thing, but then you also want to buy everything.
Absolutely. Yeah, been there, done that.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it was really it was interesting translating, seeing the same, literally the same designs translated into the finer weight yarn, and actually I've been thinking for the larger pieces, actually trying having maybe some different weight yarns hung together, and maybe trying some in an 8-ply as well, so that I can just sort of see the difference between the sort of what the heavier yarns do and the lighter yarns do, and thinking about that difference. So yeah, I'm still sort of working out exactly what the final work's going to be in February, but that's my job for the summer.
Oh, you've still got 3 months.
Yeah.
Easy peasy.
What was the breed of sheep?
So the 4-ply that I was using is actually one that I got from Ashford, and that's a Corriedale Perrindale cross. I think that this is just Corriedale. From memory. Don't quite quote me on that though, not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure it's just a Corriedale. Yeah.
Very good. Talking about landscape, quite often we will be travelling through New Zealand, and you will see something that immediately looks like a cloth. And we were in Oamaru, when was that? Few months back, and we stayed in a beautiful little shepherd's hut on the top of a hill on a farm, and across the field from the shepherd's hut there was a valley, and then the hill coming up had a field ploughed into it, and the field was completely rectangular, but it actually went over the folds of the hill, and it looked exactly like a cloth line. And I spent hours just drawing it and painting it and drawing it and painting it, just to see if I could capture that feeling of flow.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting to try and get that feeling into a cloth.
Yes, and as I say, I'm not an experienced weaver, so one of the things that I was testing while I was away was different weave structures, and which weave structures were going to give me textures that I thought sort of emulated some of those kind of things that I was after, whether it was thinking about plowed fields or planted crops, or sort of grid structures, sort of grids within grids, and yes, I ended up finding one particular weave structure. I think it's in this one, which gives a really lovely kind of either vertical line or horizontal line, depending on whether you're sort of which way around you do your lifts, and I ended up coming back to that one quite often and putting that one in quite a lot, because I really liked that aspect of it. But it was really one of the things that I really wanted to work on while I was on the residency was to try and gain some kind of understanding of the relationship between weaving drafts, where you draw out the pattern on graph paper, and then what the weave actually looks like in the cloth, which is
Yep.
they are completely different. Yeah, and so I don't think I feel like that's a lifelong learning process for sure. I certainly feel like I'm starting to get a little bit of a feel for how it works. Certainly I have more of a feel for it now than I did before the residency, where I just had no feel for it at all. But yeah, it's fascinating. I find it fascinating that going from that kind of design process where you're which is very sort of grid based, and it really doesn't bear very much relationship at all to what comes out in the fabric. Having only started weaving very recently, it's incredible how it starts to. I mean, I've used fabric for years, but I had not thought that deeply about the structure of the cloth and the way that it's made, and so it's really sort of opening up this kind of this whole new world, really, and this whole new sort of way of thinking about making, which is kind of really fascinating. I've always loved working with kind of graph paper and things. Most of the embroidery that I've made is I usually revert. Sometimes I do other things, but I usually revert to cross stitch. I've used a lot of. I've made a lot of embroidered work where I've used embroidery to include text in exhibitions. I first did it with the work that I made down here on the coast, where I was looking at abandoned mining towns on the west coast, and I was just finding that there was so much text-based information that I was taking photos of the sites, and I was finding that actually the thing that made me really respond to the site was having the information that I was gaining through the research that I was doing. And so I wanted to find a way to communicate the information to people without just having really big wall text, like big panels of wall text that they had to read in order to understand what they were seeing in the photograph. And so I sort of I was sort of thinking about ways to get text into the work itself, and at the same time I was thinking about whose histories were being told, because when I was doing the research into the town, so much of what you read of the history is about the mining, and that was what the men, largely being done by the men. There were some rare examples of women who took part in the mining, but it was pretty rare. And actually I was much more interested in the communities and the home life of the people who sort of lived there. And so including the embroidery with the samplers was a way of kind of it was really a nod to the domestic life of the people who lived there, and I kind of wanted I made them so they looked a little bit different, and I wanted them all to look like they might have been made by the women who lived there in those places. So and I possibly did that a little bit too well, because the first time I showed that work, one of the people on the front desk of the gallery told me that they kept getting asked who made the embroideries because they assumed that I was the photographer, but that I got somebody else to make the embroideries. So the next time I showed the work, I sort of changed the wording and the description of the exhibition to make it really clear that I also made the embroideries. But so I sort of saw that as a success, really, because that kind of was the intention. But yeah, anyway, so the when I plan the text, the cross-stitch text, I'm using graph paper and I'm drawing it out, and I'm working out how it fits within the space that I need to fit it in, and kind of and so I do a lot of planning on graph paper for the embroidered works. So it was really interesting, sort of shifting that into drawing out sort of plans for weave on graph paper. It's a very sort of different thing. But in a way, it has its similarity in that the drawing really doesn't, you can see that it's a plan for the finished thing, but it doesn't really look like the finished thing. But I also actually then have become quite interested in the drawings on the graph paper as well, and that's kind of become kind of a part of my practice as well. The sort of the work towards the sort of the finished.
The process is always fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, very much so.
Sketchbooks are great things to look at.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about your jacquard pieces,
sure.
because that's again a completely different thing, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, very much so. So I was really lucky in, what was it, 2021? I got to work on a digital jacquard loom that is in the textiles department at Massey where I work. At that stage I had done a very small amount of hand weaving, but I really didn't have a good understanding of things like the weave structures and things like that. Mm-hmm. But I knew that there was this loom, and I had seen it had been fairly recently bought by the university, and I had seen work online where people had woven photographs on these looms, and so I contacted some of my colleagues, and I said, would it be possible to use the loom, and sort of negotiated some time and one of the technicians to help me a little bit, and I ended up making 6 relatively large, they're about 65 centimetres square, images that were woven from my photographs. And I've got a few sort of samples that I made while I was working on this, so you can sort of see the way they look. These, in some ways, I don't necessarily want to show you these, because these are also photographs, but they don't have the detail that the final work had, because they I didn't do any work on the photographs to get them ready to weave, but all of the samples that I've got were testing out different yarn weights. So the loom was warped with the sort of the cream coloured, so that essentially they went that way, and that was the weft going across. So these 3 were sort of done all at the same time, but they've got sort of 3 different weights of yarn. I'll pass them around so that you can have a look. So these were these 3 photos were just some photos I had on the on my computer when I needed a file to quickly kind of make it. So the first one that I held up is Bridget, Christina, she was O'Donnell, and then she married James Reed, and she is my great grandmother. And these are the Clooneys, whose first names I've forgotten, but they are also my great grandparents. They're not the great greats. And then this one, this is Sophie. She was Sophie Allsweiler, and she married into the McQuarrie family, and she is also my great grandmother, and she is particularly special because her birthday is the day she was born is exactly 100 years to the day before I was born.
Oh.
You didn't know that? Yeah, I discovered that. I was like, oh look, she's got my birthday, like literally almost my actual birthday. And then so those were, and then I've got just a couple more. So this is the width. These are the small parts of the actual images that I wove, and so you can see that's the width. That's how big they were square. And I ended up using the yarn, which is the top one in this one. So the brown, the slightly kind of pale brown. I thought that I would go for a kind of that sort of charcoaly colour, but ended up preferring the kind of pale brown. I also tried mostly for a bit of fun, but also just to see if it would work. Some different colours as well, so you can see the different colours and slightly different weights, and you can see that the way that the jacquard loom works is that so these days commercial jacquard looms are fully automated, so everything's sort of computerized, but these hand sort of controlled digital jacquard looms are kind of an in-between sort of loom where they're part hand controlled and part digitally controlled. So they're attached to a computer, and you have a file that you put into the software that controls the loom, and the file has individual pixels which are either black or white. So they don't have to be photos, and a lot of people don't use them for mostly they're not used for images. So they tend to be used, they have two uses generally. They can be, textile designers can use them for prototyping before they take a design to large scale production, so they're often used for that. And artists use them to make, like I did for one-off pieces. And they're often, often the designs will be abstract, so more usually they'll be sort of abstract designs than kind of photos. But basically, you have the same number of pixels across as there are number of warp yarns, and every single individual warp yarn is controlled by a vacuum. Each heddle is controlled by a vacuum, and what the software does is it reads the first line of pixels, and if the pixel is white, in this case it is it's lifting the heddle to raise the white yarn, so that the white will be above, and if the pixel is black, it's dropping that yarn, so that when you throw the warp in whatever colour it is,
weft.
Yep. I knew I was going to get that wrong. Then your darker colour is floating over top. So essentially, every single line is a different combination of raised and lowered. If that makes sense, I don't know whether that's a very good description.
So on the jacquard loom, every individual thread can be manipulated.
Yes,
Yeah.
But is manipulated in the file that you prepare before you start weaving. So once you start weaving, you're not sort of doing things. You're very much so you press a button on a foot pedal, the yarns lift, you throw the shuttle, you pull the beater forward, you press the button again, and the next one lifts. and you're doing it quite quickly. So you're not sort of saying, oh, I want that one to go up, or I want that one to go up. So you have to spend really quite a lot of time preparing the file and making sure it's the way that you want it to be. So most of these tests were me seeing what would happen if I did this, like that. This one I think was the final file, but that one where I was testing the brown and the charcoaly colour, I worked on the file more after that one. So I spent really a lot of time on the photographs, making sure that individual pieces were going to be clear. The downside of this way of working with images, so the way that I made the files is I used a technique called no weave, which means that I didn't use any weave patterns. A lot of people who make works where they do images on these will essentially separate the image out into tonal ranges. So you might have 5 tonal ranges from black to white, and then in Photoshop they'll separate those tonal ranges out and they'll fill each tonal range with a weave fill. So what they do is they're losing any detail that they had inside that area. So like an area like this, which is a deep shadow area, it would be filled with a pattern, but it would be a pattern that would be darker than the other patterns. So you get gradation by the pattern changing on the different areas. But partly I didn't do that because I didn't really understand weaving well enough. But I think in some ways it was kind of a blessing in disguise. I also, part of the reason that people do that is that if you, in weaving, you get, if the yarn is going across a long way, you get long floats, and so you can see it where, like on the back of this one, you can see that if the float's too long, it just kind of hangs a bit loose. And if you were making textiles for, say, usage like sitting on a couch or something, you wouldn't have long floats because they'd catch on everything. For an art piece, it's not so much of a problem practically, but actually if I'm trying to make my image, if I'm trying to show up good information in my image, having long floats where they kind of hang down, it means you can't really see, you actually lose detail. So I had to spend really a lot of time going into, on the digital file, going into shadow areas and highlight areas and making sure, and often going in and just changing pixels. So this was a lot of black. I would just put in little white pixels randomly so that there was, the floats weren't too long. And I had one of the technician that I worked with, she suggested that I try not to have a float longer than 12 ends. And so I just made a grid on the Photoshop file that was 12 every 12 pixels, and I just made sure that there was a dot. So it was really going over the digital file with a fine-tooth comb, making sure, partly sort of picking out the detailed areas and partly sort of going through and making sure that, and there are areas where I have got some long floats where it doesn't really matter so much, that they kind of bunch together a wee bit. But doing it that way did mean that it sort of it shrank and stretched my images in funny ways. So in places where there was a lot of like in places where it was a mid-tone and there was a lot of like sort of close to plain weave, it would stretch the image out because it wouldn't compress down so much. And in places where there was a lot of floats, it would really shrink it down. And so you can see, I don't know whether it shows up so much on this, you can see on some of the images on the selvage, there are places where the selvage is very dense, and then there are places where it's really not dense, and that's actually the image has kind of stretched and shrunk a little bit. So that is the downside of doing it that way. But what I really love is that what you get on the back is the inverse, right? So yeah, so and it actually looks pretty amazing. There's the fire siren.
That's our testing of the fire siren. No need to panic.
It's the great benefit of living close to the fire station.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I think you get a real idea of how it works when you see the back, because you get the idea of the shadows and the highlights being kind of the opposite. But yeah, I really I think one of the I think it was a real benefit for me working on this project, having really good understanding of how to work with images in Photoshop.
Yes.
And actually, Julia Hope, who was the technician that I worked with, she walked the loom for me and she helped me kind of learn how to do it. Even though it was a lot of work for her to set it up for me to do it, I actually spent quite a lot of time showing her how I had worked on the images to get them ready to weave, and left her some quite detailed written instructions so that she could pass that knowledge on to students who were using the loom, because she knew how to use Photoshop, but she didn't have that same sort of depth of experience. And there are a few tips and kind of tricks that in adjusting photographs that I use that you wouldn't necessarily know if you hadn't spent a lot of time working on photographs in Photoshop. So so I think it was a really great. In some ways, the jacquard loom was it was kind of a moment where the two things that I really loved kind of came together in a really sort of serendipitous way. Unfortunately, it's a very sought after. Oops, I'll pass that one around as well. It's a very sought after piece of equipment, and I haven't been able to get back on it since. There's a couple of postgrad students doing really interesting projects on it, but it means that it's hard for multiple people to use it at the same time. So I hope to be able to get back on it in the future.
Yeah, fingers crossed.
Make more projects. But in the meantime, I'm really enjoying actually learning a bit more about weaving, and I'd love to when I do get a chance to get back on the jacquard loom, maybe think about how I might be able to combine the no weave technique that I used before with understanding some of the weave patterns and seeing what I can do with some sort of combination of them.
Well, you can see that this is going to help you with weave structures, shrinking and expanding your fabrics anyway. So that's
absolutely. Like I'm getting an idea of that from the hand weaving, very much so. So still very much kind of in the learning phase of weaving. Yes.
Just as an aside, we bought a jacquard piece recently. Harata Rewiri Tarapata, a Maori woman, a portrait done by Vera Cummings, which is held in Te Papa, and I can send you all the link for that. If you look on the back of the door as you go out, you'll see the jacquard. So jacquard weaving is very useful for making those kinds of images. You can get a lot of detail. The original painting does not have the same background as our jacquard piece. The jacquard piece is the background taken out and replaced with Maori design. We know nothing about the piece at all. Can't find any information about it. Don't know who made it, when it was made, where it was made. I think it's probably made within the last 20 years, probably the last 10, I would say. And it's a one-off. It's not a production piece.
Wow.
So anybody who has any information would be gratefully received. Going back to your work, so when I was in Shetland, I made this piece of Shetland tweed, which is based on landscape, looking out the window as snowstorms were coming across the land and the way that the light changed. And I wanted to evoke memory. I wanted people to understand that this was a fleeting moment and it was never to be repeated. So there is no repeat in this. It was a 30-meter length of cloth with no repeat at all. And I chose the colours as I went along, just looking out the window and choosing what I saw at that point. If you look closely at it, you'll see that there's a twill, a diagonal line happening, but the twill's fragmented. So it comes in and you see it very clearly, and then it kind of scatters and disappears and then coalesces again. And so we can pass that around. I'm going to pass it the opposite way. I'm interested in your take on memory in cloth.
Mm.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think memory is something that I'm really interested in. I often think about that and its relationship to photography. We often think of, well, we often talk about photographs as though they are memories, even though they're not the same thing. And a lot of people have sort of written about photography's relationship to memory. I think for me, and this is just my personal kind of experience of it, I guess, or the way that I think about it. I'm very I love objects. I have a lot of I have a lot of objects. Come from a family of people who collect objects. For me, often memory is very tactile. I think I like, you know, I have things that belonged to my grandmother. I've got one of her dresses. I've got another dress from a family friend growing up who I felt very connected to. And for me, I think the objects evoke the connection that I feel with them, and so for me, I think memory is tactile and it's physical, and so I guess in terms of textiles, it's very much. I'm much more interested in handmade textiles than I am in commercially made textiles, and that's partly because I'm interested in the skill of the maker, and I think it's and that's partly because it's something that I enjoy doing myself, and so there's that kind of aspect of it. But I think a lot of it is that, you know, when you're looking at an object that was made by hand, somebody spent hours and hours making by hand, maybe 100, 200 years ago, maybe longer. I think that's fascinating, you know, for me, the more I understand about how things are made, and the more appreciation I have for how long things take and the sort of time that it takes, the more appreciation I have for those older objects that where people took care and time, and I guess it becomes not my personal memory, but it's some form of collective memory. Which I am quite interested in, this idea of collective memory, how we collectively remember things, how we memorialise things. And so, textiles, you know, they're a bit delicate, and they don't necessarily maybe last in the way that a cathedral or something else lasts, but we do have very, very early made textiles, tiny fragments of things, that pieces of clay that had cloth pressed into them that shows, you know, so that you can see the way that fabric was woven thousands of years ago. And so, I think that that kind of idea of how we collectively remember our culture is, I think, particularly again in a world where maybe people are quick to move on from things in a way that is relatively new. I value things that were made by hand in the past.
It's interesting you say that you're not working with colour at the moment.
No.
In these pieces, because when, for example, classical Greek statuary, which we all thought was white and actually turned out to be really bright colours, the cloths were really bright colours, and we have some pieces in our collection, our textile collection, that are 2,000 years old, and they are coloured, so natural dyes. Some small fragments, if any of you are interested.
I think colour will come. Colour will come,
definitely, yes, it will.
It's I mean, I love I love colour. I wear a lot of colour. I use a lot of colour in my other work. I think it just it was a place to start.
Yes, one step at a time.
Yes, that's right.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, that's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. Does anybody have any questions? No? Our heads are all full. Well, thank you, Caroline.